The wind howled through the trees, carrying snow-like whispers across the empty hills. It was Christmas Eve, but there were no lights, no carols, and no joy in the air, far away from town. An old wooden cabin sat alone on top of a frozen hill. Inside that cabin lived a man named Samuel Hart, a rancher with strong hands and tired eyes. 3 winters ago, Samuel lost his wife, Mary. She had been the heart of the ranch, the one who made the house warm even in the coldest months. After she passed, Samuel stopped talking to people. He stopped going to church, stopped opening letters, and stopped celebrating Christmas. This night felt colder than the others. He lit a single candle and placed it on the table. The flame danced weakly, casting a soft glow on an empty chair across from him. He poured himself black coffee, no sugar, no cream, just bitter and hot. He stared at the steam rising, like memories trying to escape. Outside, the snow fell harder. The trees groaned under its weight. Samuel looked out the window. But there was nothing, just white and wind. He sighed, stood up, and added more wood to the fireplace. The crackle of the fire was the only sound, besides the wind's cry outside. He walked over to a shelf and picked up an old photo. It showed him and Mary sitting on the porch, smiling, holding hands. He touched her face gently through the glass. "Merry Christmas, darlin'," he whispered. Voice low, rough like gravel. A single tear rolled down his cheek, but he wiped it away quickly. He had chores to finish even on Christmas Eve. Samuel pulled on his coat, hat, and boots, and stepped out into the cold. The snow reached his knees, but he trudged forward to check on the horses in the barn. They neighed softly as he entered, his presence familiar and calm. He gave them hay, brushed their backs, and whispered to each one like they were family. The ranch was quiet, but not empty, not entirely. He still had work, still had the land, still had memories, but he also had silence. A deep kind of loneliness that grew louder each year. As he walked back to the cabin, the wind pushed harder. He had to lean into it just to move. The sky above was dark, no stars, only clouds like thick wool. His boots left deep prints in the snow, the only signs that someone lived here. He reached the front steps and paused. Something felt different. He looked around but saw nothing. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks again. He shook his head and opened the door, stepping inside and closing it behind him with a heavy sigh. The fire was still alive, flickering weakly. He warmed his hands and sat down again, facing the same empty chair. He didn't speak, just sat in the silence. That's when it happened. A knock. Samuel froze. It wasn't the wind this time. Another knock, softer, slower. He stood up slowly, his boots creaking on the wooden floor. No one ever came here, not in the snow, not on Christmas. His hand hovered over the doorknob. Unsure, another knock, this time more like a tap. Desperate, gentle, he opened the door. There she stood, a young woman, no more than 20. Her coat was thin, torn at the edges, her shoes soaked. Her face was pale, lips trembling, eyes red from crying or the cold, maybe both. In her hands, she held a small cooking pan. Scratched but clean, she didn't step inside. Just looked up at him and whispered, "I ain't got nowhere to go, sir." "But I can cook." Samuel didn't answer. He stared at her for a long moment, the wind blowing past them both. Then he stepped aside, silent. She hesitated for a second, then walked in, head down, holding the pan tight. Samuel closed the door behind her. The fire crackled again. 2 strangers now shared the warmth of the lonely cabin on the hill. Ellie stepped inside the cabin like a ghost, unsure if it was real. The warmth of the fire hit her face, and she blinked slowly, as if it hurt. Her fingers were stiff from cold, her lips cracked. But she held on to the small pan like it was treasure. Samuel said nothing. just watched her closely as she stood just inside the door. Dripping snow on the wooden floor, she looked around the room, eyes scanning the stone fireplace, the dusty bookshelf, the lonely photo on the mantel. The place was old, but neat, smelling like smoke, coffee, and something familiar she couldn't name. She finally whispered, "I don't want nothin', sir. Just a place to sit for a while." Samuel nodded once, slow and quiet, then pointed toward the wooden chair across from the fire. She walked with heavy legs and sank into the chair, her whole body shaking now that it had stopped moving. He took her pan gently and placed it on the table without asking questions. Then he poured her a cup of the strong black coffee and slid it toward her. She stared at it like it was gold, then wrapped her hands around it, letting the steam kiss her frozen cheeks. Silence filled the room like thick snow outside. No words. Just crackling fire and the slow sound of her breathing returning to normal. Samuel leaned back in his own chair and watched her without judgment. He didn't ask where she came from, or why she was alone, maybe because he already knew. After a while, Ellie whispered, "I'm a good cook." "Sir?" Her voice was soft, almost ashamed. "I worked in diners, shelters, even one hotel kitchen in the city." She looked down, her voice cracking. "But I couldn't keep any of them." Samuel didn't respond, but his eyes softened. She continued, her words pouring out like a slow confession. "They said I was too quiet, too small, too strange. And I didn't fight back." She took a shaky sip of coffee. "I'm not good at much, but if you got food, I can make it right." He nodded again. Still silent, then he stood, opened a cabinet, and pulled out a few supplies: flour, salt, eggs, and old bacon. He placed them gently on the small counter and turned to her. "You said you can cook," he said in his low gravel voice. "Let's see." Ellie looked at the ingredients like a child given crayons for the first time. She stood slowly, her legs still weak, and walked to the counter. Her hands moved on their uncracking eggs, mixing flour, slicing bacon. She didn't talk now, just cooked. The way she moved showed years of quiet experience. Not fast, but graceful. The smell of bacon filled the cabin. Samuel sat back in his chair, breathing it in like a man remembering a forgotten dream. He closed his eyes for a moment, and in that moment, he could almost hear Mary's laugh again. Almost. Ellie made biscuits from scratch, fried bacon till it was just crisp, and scrambled the eggs like silk. Then she plated the food gently, as if it was a gift. She placed the plate in front of Samuel and stepped back without a word. He looked at the food, then at her, and nodded. The first bite was warm, perfect, like something that reached through the years and tugged at his soul. He chewed slowly, not saying anything, but his eyes said enough. She watched with a nervous hope in her eyes. Unsure if she had earned her place for the night, he finally looked up and spoke softly. "You stay tonight." Her lips parted, but no words came out. Just a nod and a trembling breath. She sat down again, shoulders dropping for the first time. Safe. The storm outside was growing stronger, but inside the cabin, it was warm, not just from the fire, but from something else. Two strangers, both carrying different kinds of silence, now sitting in a place that didn't feel so empty anymore. And in the center of the table, the little pan she carried still rested, scratched, old, and full of stories, just like her. Morning came slow and gray over the hill. The snow outside hadn't stopped, but the wind had calmed inside the cabin. The fire had burned low, and only a few embers glowed in the stone hearth. Ellie was already awake, sitting near the stove with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Watching the orange light fade, Samuel stepped out of his bedroom quietly, boots heavy on the wooden floor. He saw her sitting there, curled up like a small bird waiting for the sun. She didn't hear him at first, too focused on the quiet warmth of the dying fire. But then she turned slightly and gave him a small nod. Not a smile, just a silent hello. "I'll get the wood," Samuel said in a low voice. She didn't argue, just nodded again, and pulled the blanket closer when the door opened. Cold air rushed in like a warning, but Samuel didn't flinch. He moved through the snow toward the shed, slow but steady, like he'd done it 1,000 times before. Inside, Ellie stood up and moved to the kitchen. She looked at the supplies again bare, but enough she found a pan. The same one she carried through the storm and cleaned it with care. Then she filled it with eggs and a bit of yesterday's bacon fat. The only oil she could find by the time Samuel returned with firewood stacked in his arms. The smell of eggs filled the cabin. His eyebrows lifted just slightly, but he said nothing. He dropped the wood beside the fireplace and knelt to feed the fire. Ellie knelt beside him without a word and helped stack the kindling. Together, they brought the fire back to life. It crackled and popped, pushing warmth back into the room like a slow heartbeat. Samuel leaned back, breathing in the comfort. Ellie handed him a small plate of food and sat across from him on the floor. Her own plate in her lap. They ate in silence. The only sound was the wind whispering through the cracks in the walls and the fire's gentle roar. Then, for the first time, she spoke more than a whisper. "I thought I was going to freeze last night," she said quietly. "But this stove—" "It's warm again." Samuel nodded slowly, chewing. "It ain't just the stove," he muttered, almost to himself. She tilted her head, confused, but didn't ask. Instead, she looked around the cabin, eyes noticing details she missed last night: old cowboy hats on hooks, a bookshelf filled with worn-out paperbacks, a picture of a horse pinned to the wall. The place had history, like it had seen love, loss, and maybe now something new. "I used to dream about places like this," Ellie said suddenly, eyes still scanning the walls. Quiet places where nobody yells, nobody throws things. Her voice caught, and she stopped, embarrassed. Samuel didn't ask questions, just took another bite of food, slow and thoughtful. "You runnin' from someone?" he asked after a long pause. Ellie looked down, her fingers tightening around her fork. "Not someone. Everyone," she said, voice shaking. "They never saw me. Just a burden. Too skinny, too quiet, too much trouble." He looked at her long and hard, then stood up and walked to the window. The snow outside was still falling, gentle now, like feathers instead of knives. He said without turning, "You ain't trouble, girl. You're just tired." Ellie's breath caught in her throat, and she turned her head to hide her tears. He walked back to the fire and threw on another log. The flames jumped up, bright and warm again, filling the room with light. "You can stay till the snow stops," he said finally. "We'll figure the rest later." Ellie nodded, her voice gone, but her eyes full of something new, maybe hope, maybe just surprise. She cleaned up their plates, careful and quiet. Samuel watched her from the side, noticing how gently she moved, like someone used to being in other people's way. But here, she wasn't in the way. She was part of the warmth, part of the cabin, part of something slowly waking up again. That night, she sat by the stove again, her blanket wrapped tight, her eyes on the fire. Samuel sat nearby, whittling a piece of wood. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was peaceful, like the warmth rising from a cold stove, slow and steady, filling the cracks in both of them. The snow didn't stop the next day, nor the day after. The world outside the cabin remained buried in white silence. But inside, something else was growing, something warm, careful, and almost invisible. Ellie no longer flinched at sudden sounds. She no longer slept curled in a ball on the edge of the couch. Now she sat with her legs stretched in front of the fire, sipping tea, sometimes even humming softly. Her pan, the one she arrived with, stayed on the hook near the stove like it belonged there. Samuel noticed things, though he never said them out loud. He noticed how she folded laundry with gentle hands, like she was folding stories. How she spoke to the horses when she helped him in the barn. Soft words that made even the skittish ones come near. And how she placed an extra slice of bread on his plate, even when food was tight. Every corner of the cabin that used to feel too quiet now felt lived in again. Ellie had scrubbed the old windows until the sun could peek through them. She added dried flowers in an empty jar near the sink. And once, Samuel caught her sewing a tear in an old curtain. Like it was worth saving one evening as Samuel chopped firewood. Ellie stood on the porch watching him. She wore an old coat he had given her too big, but warm. Her breath came out in clouds, her eyes calm. This place. She said softly, "It's nothing like where I came from." Samuel didn't reply right away. He placed the axe down and leaned on the handle. "You run from a place or from the people in it?" he asked. Ellie took a deep breath. "Both," she said. "But mostly from the girl I was there." Samuel nodded, understanding in his silence. "You ain't that girl now," he said, turning back to his woodpile. Ellie watched him for a moment longer, then smiled a little. She hadn't smiled in months, not like that. Not honest, not soft. Later that night, Ellie stood in the kitchen making soup from leftover bones and beans. The smell filled the cabin again, cozy and rich. Samuel sat at the table. Polishing his old boots, he looked up and asked, "You ever think about going back?" Ellie paused, then stirred the pot slowly. "No," she said. "Back means going hungry, being cold. Not just outside, but inside too." She turned to face him. "Here. Even the silence feels different." Samuel met her eyes, and for a brief moment, something passed between them, men spoken but real. After dinner, Ellie took out a small bundle of cloth she kept in her coat. She unfolded it on the table, revealing a worn-out recipe book, its pages stained and torn. "My mama's," she explained. "She didn't have much, but she wrote every meal she made." She ran her fingers over the names: cornbread, gravy, fried apples, pie with no sugar. "I memorized most of them," she whispered. "I used to cook just to remember her voice." Samuel leaned forward and pointed at one of the pages. "Apple biscuits?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Ellie nodded. "Best thing she ever made." He smiled then. "For the first time in days, a real one, small but warm." "You'll have to make them for me one day," he said. Ellie looked at the flour bag on the counter. "Almost empty, someday soon," she replied, hope sneaking into her voice. That night, after she cleaned the dishes and folded the recipe book, she looked around the room slowly. The table, the fire, the old photo of Samuel's wife still on the mantel. And she whispered to herself, "This ain't mine, but it feels like I'm part of it." Samuel sat in his chair, whittling again. He didn't ask questions, didn't push. He knew sometimes the best way to heal someone was to simply let them exist, quietly, safely, with no expectations. And so they sat to people from different storms, sharing warmth, food, and the kind of peace that only comes when you stop running. Ellie never thought she'd find a place like this. But somehow, the lonely cabin on the hill was no longer just his. The sky turned gray that morning, darker than usual. The air felt different, heavier. Like it was holding its breath, Samuel stepped outside, boots crunching over snow, and looked up. Thick clouds rolled over the hills, warning him the worst was coming inside. Ellie was kneading dough with flour-dusted hands. She didn't notice the change in weather until the wind pushed against the window panes. Samuel stepped back in, shaking snow off his coat. "Storm's cumin," he said quietly. "Not a light one." Ellie paused, her fingers pressing into the dough. "Bad?" she asked, wiping her hands on a towel. He nodded, hanging his coat by the door. 3-day kind. Maybe longer, without another word. She moved into action. They worked together, sealing the windows, bringing in firewood. She filled pots with water. He checked the oil lanterns. It wasn't panic, just silent teamwork. Like they'd been doing this forever. By nightfall, the storm hit like a freight train. The wind screamed around the cabin, shaking the roof and rattling the shutters. Snow flew sideways, thick as smoke. The fire roared in the hearth, but the cold still crawled through the cracks. Ellie sat curled under a quilt, her face lit by the soft flame of a lantern. Samuel poured hot tea into 2 tin cups and handed her one. She took it gratefully, her hands trembling from more than just the cold. "This storm," she said softly. "It sounds angry," Samuel nodded, sipping his tea. "Winter's up here, don't play fair," he said. "But we've got enough to last." She looked at him with tired eyes. The storm reflected in their silence. "I used to be scared of nights like this," she admitted. "Because I didn't know if I'd see the morning." He didn't say anything, just stared into the fire, but Ellie didn't need words this time. His calm presence was enough. It wrapped around her like a second blanket, steady and strong. The power blinked out just before midnight. Lights died, the radio clicked off, silence pressed in even harder. But Samuel simply lit another lantern, and Ellie lit a second candle, placing it near the stove in that flickering glow. They played cards on the floor. Simple games, go fish, war, even a slow game of rummy. Ellie laughed once when she won a round, and Samuel, surprised, gave a half smile that stayed longer than it should have. Sometime after the second game, Ellie stood up and walked to the kitchen. She pulled out her mother's old recipe book and flipped to the last page. No ingredients for that one, just a note in faded pencil. "For the coldest nights, just stay close and share the warmest story." She read it twice, then looked over at Samuel. "You ever hear a story that saves you?" she asked. He set his cards down and leaned back. "I lived one," he said, voice low, "but I lost it too fast." Ellie nodded, not asking more. She understood that kind of hurt. So she began telling her own story, instead softly, slowly, like unwrapping something fragile. Not everything, but enough to let him see the girl behind the cook. She told him about her father's silence, her mother's tired hands, the shelters that promised hope but took her trust instead, the kitchens where she worked for meals, not money, and the long walks with no destination, just away. Always away. Samuel listened, not interrupting once. The storm howled around them, but inside the cabin, it was quiet, like the walls were listening too. When she finished, she whispered, "This is the first roof that hasn't leaked on me." He didn't say, "I'm sorry," or "That's hard." Instead, he looked at her and said, "Well, it ain't leaking now." They both chuckled, small and tired, but real. Then the storm knocked a shutter loose, slamming it hard against the wall. Samuel grabbed his coat and stepped outside to fix it. Ellie rushed after him, but he turned and said, "You stay. I got this." When he came back inside, snow covered his hat and shoulders. She handed him a towel without a word, and together they sat in silence again. Close this time, shoulders almost touching, warmth rising between them like a second fire. The storm outside would last 2 more days. But in that sealed cabin, something else had started. Not just survival, but belonging, and neither of them knew it yet. But that night would change everything. The storm had passed. The snow outside now sat thick and quiet like a blanket over the world. The sky was finally clear, the sun barely making it through. But inside the cabin, the warmth remained, not just from the fire, but from something harder to name. Ellie stood at the window, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. She watched the snowflakes melt against the glass. Her cheeks were pink, her eyes calmer. Samuel sat at the table behind her, mending an old pair of gloves with thick thread. Neither of them had spoken much that morning. There was no need. The silence between them wasn't empty any more, it was gentle, a kind of peace that doesn't need explaining. But peace, like the snow, doesn't last forever. Not out here. Not for people like them. Just before noon, Ellie caught movement through the trees. At first, she thought it was a deer, maybe a fox. But then she saw the shadow of a figure, too, walking slowly toward the cabin. Boots sinking into deep snow, her hands froze around the cup. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice suddenly small. He looked up, then followed her gaze through the window. To men big, broad, dressed in heavy coats. Faces covered with scarves were getting closer. Samuel stood, set the gloves down, and walked calmly to the wall. He reached behind a coat rack and pulled out a double-barrel shotgun. He didn't raise it, just held it steady in his arms. "You know him?" he asked quietly, without turning. Ellie's voice trembled. Yes, her face had gone pale. Her hands shaking. "They followed me. I didn't think they'd find me out here." Samuel nodded once, slow and steady, then walked to the door. He didn't open it, just waited. The two men came closer. Stopping just short of the steps, one of them pulled his scarf down, revealing a cruel smile beneath a jagged scar. "Well, well," he said, voice sharp like ice. "Didn't think you'd run this far?" Samuel didn't flinch. He stood tall in the doorway, the shotgun resting across his arms like a warning. "She's not going anywhere," he said. Voice calm but firm. "This here's my land. And I don't recall inviting you." The second man stepped forward. Eyes narrowed. "We ain't looking for trouble," he said. "We just want the girl." Ellie stepped beside Samuel, her fingers gripping the back of his shirt. "I'm not going back," she said, louder than she thought she could. "I'm done." Scarface laughed. "She owes us. She don't owe you nothin'," Samuel said sharply. "Not anymore." The wind picked up again, snow swirling between them. Samuel took one step forward, the barrel of the shotgun now slightly raised. "You've got 10 seconds to turn around," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It carried the weight of someone who had nothing left to fear, and everything left to protect. The two men looked at each other. They saw something in Samuel's eyes. Something final. Scarface spat into the snow, then turned without a word. They both walked back into the trees. Fading like shadows, Ellie stood frozen, watching them disappear. Then she broke into silent tears, her knees almost giving way. Samuel didn't say anything. He just set the shotgun down and gently guided her to the chair. She cried for a long time, not just out of fear, but out of relief. Out of the shock that someone finally stood for her, not for money, not for gain, just because she mattered. When she could speak again, she looked up, eyes red and full of something new. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. Samuel shrugged, pouring her another cup of coffee. "Didn't have to," he said, "but I wanted to." She wrapped her hands around the warm mug and stared into the fire. And for the first time since she came to that cabin, she truly believed she was safe. Not just for a night, not just from the cold, but from the past, from the fear, from the people who once owned her story. Now she was writing a new one, and in that cabin on the hill, it wasn't just the snow that melted. It was the fear inside her chest, one silent tear at a time. It disappeared into the warmth of a place she never thought she'd find. The morning of Christmas arrived with soft sunlight touching the snow. It painted the frozen world in gold and white, peaceful and still. Inside the cabin, the fire was already burning strong. The smell of coffee and baked bread filled the room. Ellie was up early, wearing Samuel's old flannel shirt over her dress. It hung loose on her small frame, but it wrapped her in warmth. She stood at the stove, flipping biscuits in a cast-iron pan. Her pan, the same one she'd carried through the storm now, had a home on the hook beside the fire. Samuel watched her from his chair, a blanket over his legs. He didn't say much, just sipped his coffee. But the way he looked at her held something deeper than words. A quiet thankfulness, a quiet peace. "Breakfast's ready," Ellie said with a smile that reached her eyes. She set the table with chipped plates, mismatched mugs, and love. They sat down together, eating slowly, as if the moment shouldn't be rushed. It wasn't a feast, but it was warm, filling, and real. "I never thought I'd be warm on Christmas again," Ellie whispered. Samuel nodded. "Neither did I." She looked down at her hands, then back up at him. "Back then, I used to wrap up in newspapers and pretend they were blankets." Samuel's face tightened. "Just slightly," she continued. "I'd watch people through restaurant windows. Families laughing, sharing food." She paused. "All I wanted was to be invited in." Just once, he looked around the small room, then at her. "You're not outside anymore." Ellie blinked fast, then smiled again. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something smaller wooden button tied to a string. "I don't have presents," she said shyly. "But this was my mom's sewing kit charm." She slid it across the table. "It brings luck." Samuel took it slowly, holding it in his palm like it was made of gold. "Thank you," he said, voice low. Then he stood, walked to the shelf, and returned with a folded handkerchief. "This was Mary's," he said, placing it gently in front of Ellie. "She'd want someone like you to have it." Ellie opened it slowly, eyes widening. Inside was a small silver locket, worn but shining in the firelight. She opened it and gasped a tiny photo of Samuel and Mary on their wedding day. "Are you sure?" she asked, voice breaking. He nodded. "She gave me love I never thought I'd find." His eyes met Ellie's, steady and kind. "Now it's your turn." She pressed the locket to her chest, and for the first time in years, she felt like she truly belonged. They sat together after breakfast, watching the snow fall gently through the window. No music, no lights, no trees, the sound of the fire, and two hearts quietly healing. Later, they fed the horses together, laughing when one stole the carrot from Ellie's hand. She looked at Samuel and said, This feels like a dream I didn't know I had." He smiled, brushing snow from her shoulder. "It's real," he said. "You're here, and you're not going anywhere." As the sun dipped behind the hills, Ellie lit a candle and placed it on the windowsill. "For the people still out there," she whispered. "The ones looking for a warm place." Samuel placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "You gave this place its warmth back," he said. "Don't forget that." That night, they ate the last of the biscuits and drank hot cocoa made from a dusty tin she found in the pantry. It tasted sweet, like something from childhood. They sat close by the fire, shoulders touching. Neither spoke, because everything had already been said without words. And when Ellie finally fell asleep on the couch, the locket still in her hand, Samuel covered her with a blanket. He looked down at her. This girl who had nothing but a pan and a soft voice, and somehow brought life back into the cabin he thought would always be silent. He sat down in his chair, stared at the fire, and whispered, "Merry Christmas." Mary then, with a small smile. He added, "Don't worry, darlin'. She's home now." Winter didn't end right away. Snow still fell often, and the nights remained long and cold. But something had changed inside the cabin. The air no longer felt heavy with sorrow, felt warm, lived in, even hopeful. Ellie had stopped counting the days since she arrived. She no longer wondered when she'd have to leave, because for the first time in her life, no one was pushing her out. She had a place, a purpose, and a man who treated her like she mattered. Each morning, she woke before the sun. She stoked the fire, made breakfast, and sometimes left a small note for Samuel on the table. Just simple words, "Thank you," or "Coffee's hot," or once, "You've got kind eyes." He never said much back, but he kept the notes in a drawer near his tools. Together, they repaired the old barn. They patched the roof, fixed the broken fence, even planted seeds in pots near the window. When spring came, they said they'd grow tomatoes, herbs, and maybe flowers. Ellie laughed at the thought she'd never grown anything in her life. Samuel taught her how to ride one of the older horses. At first, she was scared. But he walked beside her, hands steady on the reins. "You ain't gonna fall," he said, "but if you do, I'll be here." Those words stayed with her longer than he realized. One day, Ellie brought out her mother's recipe book again. She flipped to a page she hadn't dared to try before Appel biscuits. She worked slowly, hands dusted with flour. Her brow furrowed in focus. When the biscuits came out of the oven, golden and sweet-smelling, she nearly cried. She served them warm, placing a plate in front of Samuel like it was a gift. He took a bite, then looked at her, quiet for a moment. "These taste like something I forgot I missed," he said. She smiled through watery eyes, whispering, "Mama would have liked to hear that." Later that evening, they sat on the porch. The snow was melting now, and small patches of brown earth peeked through. Birds chirped in the distance, the first sign that winter was ending. Ellie leaned her head on Samuel's shoulder and sighed. "I used to think I'd always be alone," she said softly. "I thought I'd just move from place to place, cooking in silence." Never being seen, Samuel didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Some people are just waiting to be found." She turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you find me, Samuel? Or did I find you?" He smiled, weathered and kind. "Maybe we found each other," he said, "right when we needed to." The next week, Samuel drove them into town. It was Ellie's first time back among people in months. They went to the market, the feed store, and even stopped at the bakery. People looked at her, not with judgment, but with curiosity. Who was this quiet girl beside the old rancher? Samuel introduced her simply. "This is Ellie. She's with me." That was all he said. And all that needed saying. No one asked questions. No one needed to. The way they walked together, side by side, told the whole story. At night, back in the cabin, Ellie stood by the window with a silver locket around her neck. She looked at the stars and thought of the girl she used to be. Cold, scared, wandering with nothing but a pan in her hand. And now warm, safe, and loved. One night, while she tucked her recipe book back on the shelf, she looked at Samuel and asked, "Do you think people like us deserve second chances?" He looked up from his chair, then answered without hesitation, "We don't just deserve them, Ellie. Sometimes we are them for each other." And in that moment, she knew she hadn't just found shelter, or food, or safety. She had found something far rarer home. And not just a place, but a person who welcomed her with quiet strength and unspoken kindness. From that Christmas forward, no matter how cold the winters got, the cabin on the hill was never lonely again. Because the stove always stayed warm and love quiet. Steady love lived in every corner of that little home.